Take, say, Italy today. Take, say, Italy today, or Germany today. I mean, the differences among the things that we call German are enormous, so enormous as to lead to non-mutual intelligibility. You have to learn the national language when you go to school. It's a different language than the one you spoke at home. What happens is that between generations, there are usually small changes having to do with other influences from the outside and so on. And these things are cumulative. Sometimes they lead to pretty dramatic changes. When we talk about language change, that's very misleading. You know, it's like predicting the weather. There's just too many things going on. Human life is a pretty complicated affair.
The closer I get to the border between France and Germany, the closer the languages become.
Well, first of all, you're assuming the French is different from German. If you go from, say, Paris to Rome, as you go toward the Italian border, it starts to sound more like Italian, and at some point it becomes Italian. By now, there's enough national unity and so on, so you can really find a border. But if you go back a little ways, there was no border. There was just I wouldn't say a continuum. There's just constant changes and fluctuations and variations. And you started speaking one thing in one place and another thing in another place, and they're not mutually intelligible often. But along the way, there are just all sorts of changes. In France, this position is kind of extreme. In fact, if you go back to its origins, it's even a little bit comical. I don't know if anybody's actually studied it, but if you go back to, say, the 18th century and you read, say, Diderot, he says France is going to be the language of science, and German and English will be the languages of literature. And the reason for this is that French is very clear. In France, the words follow the order of the thoughts, whereas if you listen to German and English, the words don't quite follow the words of the thought. So French is good for telling the truth because of its, what later came to be called its Gallic lucidity and clarity, whereas German and English, maybe Italian, they're good languages for telling fantasies and falsehoods, so they'll be the languages of literature. Now, it's a sort of naive point of view, but you can see what was going on in his head. I mean, for him, the words in French follow the order of thoughts. When you hear German, it seems all confused. And I suspect that the mythology of the purity and lucidity and clarity of French goes back to ideas of that kind. After all, French culture had a certain dominance and appeal for a long time, so these attitudes get established. And some of them may have prestige associated with them. For example, some of them may be the speech of a conquering group or a wealthy group or a priestly caste or one thing or another, and we may decide, okay, those are the good ones and some other one's the bad one. But if social and political relations reversed, we'd make the opposite conclusions.
But that raises an interesting question. Why does language have rules? Why were we taught these rules in grade school?
Well, when you're taught rules of your own language in grade school, the chances are very strong that what you're being taught is false. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to be taught it.
I can see every grade school teacher about to throw an orange at you on the screen.
Well, let me be a little more nuanced. One of the things you learn in grade school is the literary language. Now, in English, the literary standard is not so radically different from what, say, you and I grew up with, but it's somewhat different. The literary standard is not what I learned in the streets. And when I went to school, I was taught the literary standard. Now, the literary standard has some principles associated with it, some of which are those of a real language, some of which are completely artificial. They were made up by people who had crazy ideas about language. The reason you have to teach them is because they are not the person's language. Your actual language, nobody teaches you. You don't learn it any more than you learn to see. Now, the fact is that the system that grows in the brain is sometimes different from a system which is regarded, for whatever reason, as necessary or appropriate or something, some prestige dialect. And it may be different from what grew in your brain. It typically is. So what we call good English is a system which is partly artificial, I should say, which is taught to people because it was legislated to be good English. And you ask the question, why do you have to teach people? Well, you have to teach them because it's artificial. It's not their language.